The morning sun had barely risen over Atlanta's skyline when Sarah Collins' alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m. She wasn't due in court until 9 a.m., but years of working as a federal prosecutor had taught her the value of being prepared. Her small but elegant apartment in downtown Atlanta reflected her organized nature, with case files neatly stacked on her home office desk and her court attire always ready the night before. Today was different, though. Sarah wasn't heading to the federal courthouse, where she usually commanded respect as an assistant United States attorney. Instead, she needed to handle a simple personal matter at the municipal court, a disputed parking ticket that she believed was wrongly issued. She chose to dress more casually, wearing a neat navy blue blazer over a white blouse and black pants. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, Sarah carefully pinned back her natural hair, which she had recently started wearing proudly after years of straightening it. At 35, her face showed the determination that had helped her graduate at the top of her class from Howard Law School and secure her prestigious position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Just a quick court appearance, she told herself, grabbing a banana and her travel mug filled with fresh coffee. Her Mercedes, a recent reward for winning a major corruption case, waited in the parking garage. The car was her pride and joy, though she often noticed the surprised looks from people who saw a young black woman stepping out of such an expensive vehicle. The morning traffic moved slowly through downtown Atlanta, but Sarah wasn't worried. She had left herself plenty of time to make the 9 a.m. appearance. She turned on NPR, listening to the morning news while mentally reviewing her documentation for the parking ticket dispute. The ticket had been issued in a spot where the parking signs were contradictory, and she had photographs to prove it. At 8:15 a.m., her car's Bluetooth system announced an incoming call. The display showed it was from her boss, the U.S. Attorney himself. Sarah's heart rate quickened. A direct call from him usually meant something urgent. "Sarah, I apologize for the early call." Her boss voice came through the speakers. "We have a situation with the Thompson trafficking case. The defense just submitted a last-minute motion that could derail our prosecution. I need your eyes on this immediately." Sarah gripped her steering wheel tighter. The Thompson case was one of the biggest human trafficking cases in Georgia's history. "Of course, sir. What's the timeline?" "The judge has given us until noon to respond. I'm sending the documents to your email now. Can you review them and call me back with your analysis?" "Yes, sir," Sarah responded professionally, though her mind was already racing. She had planned to park at 8:30 a.m., giving herself plenty of time to find the right courtroom. Now she would need to find somewhere to pull over and review these urgent documents. Sarah managed to find a spot in a small coffee shop's parking lot. She pulled out her laptop, connected it to her phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the defense's motion. The legal arguments were complex, and she found herself taking detailed notes. Time ticked by as she analyzed each point, determined to provide thorough feedback. When she finally looked at her watch, her heart sank. It was 8:50 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and she knew finding parking would take time. Sarah quickly called her boss back, discussed her findings, and promised a more detailed review after her court appearance. Back in traffic, she tried to stay calm. She had never been late to court before. It went against everything she stood for. But she also knew her job as a federal prosecutor came with responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. The Thompson case could affect dozens of lives, and that morning's motion could impact the entire prosecution. She finally pulled into the municipal court parking lot at 9:10 a.m. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed with a thank you message from her boss, noting that her quick analysis had been extremely helpful. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. At least the delay had served an important purpose. What she didn't know, as she rushed up the courthouse steps with her documentation in hand, was that her slightly tardy arrival was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted prejudices in the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. Judge William Barrett's courtroom awaited her, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge William Barrett's courtroom had a reputation for strict rules and cold efficiency. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with an air of authority built over 30 years on the bench. This Monday morning, he sat elevated above everyone else, his black robe pressed and perfect, watching as people filed into his courtroom for the 9 a.m. session. The municipal courtroom was already busy. 23 people sat in the wooden benches, most of them there for minor violations, parking tickets, traffic infractions, and small disputes. Judge Barrett noticed that most of the early arrivals were white, dressed in business attire, their paperwork organized and ready. He nodded approvingly at their punctuality. "All rise." The bailiff called out at exactly 9 a.m. Judge Barrett entered, his routine practice with precision, calling the first few cases quickly and efficiently. He took pride in running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. Tardiness, in his view, was a sign of disrespect for the law itself. At 9:15 a.m., the courtroom door opened. Sarah Collins entered quietly, trying not to disturb the proceedings. But Judge Barrett immediately stopped mid-sentence during another case, his eyes narrowing at the interruption, focusing on the black woman who dared to enter his courtroom late. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and cold. The other case was temporarily forgotten. Sarah walked to the podium, her posture straight and professional despite the hostile reception. Judge Barrett looked down at his calendar. "You must be Sarah Collins, scheduled for 9 a.m., he emphasized the time, his tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time, Miss Collins?" Before Sarah could explain, Judge Barrett continued, his voice growing louder with each sentence, designed to make an example of her. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Earlier, a white businessman had arrived 5 minutes late, and the judge had barely noticed. "In this courtroom, we have rules," Judge Barrett lectured, shuffling papers on his desk without looking at Sarah. "This isn't some neighborhood gathering where you can just show up whenever you please. This is a court of law." Sarah stood calmly at the podium, her hands folded in front of her. She noticed how the judge hadn't even looked at her credentials or paperwork yet. His assumptions were written all over his face. She could see it in the way his eyes dismissed her professional attire, the way he spoke to her as if she were a child. The bailiff, an older black man named James Wilson, watched the scene with growing concern. In his 15 years in this courtroom, he had seen this pattern before. He caught Sarah's eye briefly, giving her a subtle look of understanding. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. "You may not," Judge Barrett interrupted. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergency. None of that matters here." The time was set for 9 a.m. He picked up his gavel, as if the simple presence of it would emphasize his authority. The other people waiting for their cases watched intently. A young white woman who had arrived at 9:10 a.m. sat quietly, her late arrival completely unaddressed. A pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom, even if Judge Barrett himself seemed blind to it. "This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedures," Judge Barrett continued, his face growing slightly red. His authority was challenged simply by Sarah's composed demeanor. "Perhaps a fine will help you remember the importance of punctuality." Sarah stood her ground, maintaining her professional composure. She had faced prejudice before in her career, but this was different. This was a clear abuse of power happening in real time, in front of witnesses, in the very system she had sworn to serve. The tension in the courtroom grew thick. Other defendants watched with a mixture of sympathy and concern. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman who had worked with Judge Barrett for years, looked increasingly uncomfortable as she typed the proceedings into her computer. What Judge Barrett didn't realize, as he prepared to announce his punishment, was that his next words would set in motion a series of events that would challenge not just his authority, but the entire system's approach to equal justice under the law. The real shock of the morning was yet to come. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face stern as he prepared to deliver his punishment. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall courtroom windows cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look even more imposing than usual. "Miss Collins," he announced, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt." He paused, letting the amount sink in. It was one of the highest fines he had given for tardiness this year, though he didn't mention this fact. Sarah stood perfectly still at the podium, her mind quickly noting every detail of this interaction. She observed how the judge's eyes never quite met hers, how his tone carried the particular edge she had heard too many times before. In her career as a federal prosecutor, she had developed a sixth sense for recognizing prejudice masked as authority. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, typed the fine into the computer system with hesitant fingers. She had been keeping records in this courtroom for 12 years, and something about this situation made her uncomfortable enough to create a separate note in her personal log. Just last week, a white male attorney had arrived 20 minutes late, offering no explanation, and had received only a verbal warning. Furthermore, Judge Barrett continued, seemingly encouraged by Sarah's silence. Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility. He lifted a sheet of paper, pretending to read from it, though it was clearly just for show. The justice system functions on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos. In the gallery, the other defendants watched with varying reactions. A young white woman in a business suit checked her watch, remembering that she too had arrived late, but received no comment from the judge. An elderly black man shook his head slightly, having seen this scene play out too many times before. The bailiff, James Wilson, maintained his professional stance by the judge's bench, but his jaw tightened noticeably. In his 15 years of service, he had kept a mental record of such incidents, though he never spoke about them. Today's fine was significantly higher than usual, and the timing of it all seemed particularly harsh. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath. She had handled countless cases in federal court, prosecuted dangerous criminals, and faced down hardened defense attorneys. This situation was different. It was personal, yet it represented something much bigger than herself. She carefully pulled out her phone and made a quick note of the exact time and amount of the fine. Additionally, Judge Barrett added, warming to his role as disciplinarian, "You'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late with that as well." A few nervous laughs came from the gallery, quickly silenced by the tension in the air. The morning sun had shifted, now illuminating Sarah's face as she stood at the podium. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes held a determination that would have made a wiser judge pause. She had spent years building cases, gathering evidence, and pursuing justice. Now, unwittingly, Judge Barrett was providing her with every element needed to expose systemic bias in his courtroom. "Do you understand the fine as I have explained it?" Judge Barrett asked, his tone suggesting he expected nothing but meek acceptance. Sarah met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I understand, Your Honor." The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah knew that this morning's events would be the catalyst for something far greater than a simple parking ticket dispute. Sarah left the courtroom, her mind racing. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air helped calm her. She took out her phone and made another note. Judge Barrett, $500 fine for tardiness, discriminatory treatment compared to others. She had a feeling that this incident was just the beginning of a larger battle. Sarah had no intention of letting the matter rest. She knew she had to tread carefully, but she also knew that if she allowed Judge Barrett's behavior to go unchecked, it would continue to harm others who may not have the resources or resilience to fight back. She took a deep breath and dialed a number she had used only a few times before. "Hi, Gloria, it's Sarah," she said when the other line picked up. Gloria Thompson was a respected civil rights attorney and an old friend from law school. "I need some advice on a matter that just happened in municipal court. I think it might be a case of systemic bias." Gloria's voice was filled with concern. "Tell me everything." Sarah recounted the entire incident, from the moment she entered the courtroom to the judge's harsh words and excessive fine. Gloria listened intently, occasionally asking questions. "This is serious, Sarah," Gloria said when Sarah finished. "Judge Barrett's behavior sounds like a clear abuse of power. If you're ready to pursue this, we can start gathering more evidence. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy." Sarah nodded, even though Gloria couldn't see her. "I know, but I can't just stand by and let this happen. Not when I have the ability to do something about it." "All right," Gloria said, her tone turning determined. "Let's start by documenting everything. We'll need statements from witnesses and, if possible, any records that show a pattern of this behavior. I have a few contacts who might be able to help." Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Thank you, Gloria. They'll start reaching out to people who were in the courtroom. I think the bailiff, James Wilson, might be willing to talk. Good, Gloria replied. The more people we have willing to testify, the stronger our case will be. And Sarah, remember, this is bigger than just you. You're standing up for everyone who's been mistreated by the system. Sarah hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. She knew that exposing Judge Barrett's bias would be a difficult and potentially career-risking endeavor, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. She couldn't let fear hold her back. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah reached out to James Wilson, the bailiff, who confirmed that he had seen similar incidents involving Judge Barrett. He agreed to provide a statement, though he was understandably cautious about risking his job. Sarah also spoke with Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, who hinted at records showing discrepancies in how Judge Barrett treated different defendants. Though Mrs. Thompson was hesitant, she promised to think about how she could help. Gloria, meanwhile, began working on the legal side of things, drafting a formal complaint and starting the process of gathering evidence. She also reached out to several advocacy groups, knowing that public pressure could be an important factor in pushing for change. Sarah continued her work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, but the events of that morning never strayed far from her thoughts. Every time she stepped into a courtroom, she was reminded of the power dynamics at play and the responsibility she had to use her position to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone. One afternoon, a week after the incident, Sarah received a call from Gloria. "Sarah, I think we have enough to make a formal complaint," Gloria said. "But I need to know if you're truly ready for this. Once we go public, there's no turning back." Sarah took a deep breath. She thought about the other defendants in the courtroom that day. The young white woman who had arrived late without consequence. The elderly black man who had shaken his head in recognition of the unfairness. She thought about the countless others who had faced similar treatment without anyone to stand up for them. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Let's do this." Gloria's voice held a note of pride. "All right, I'll file the complaint tomorrow. And Sarah, no matter what happens, know that you're making a difference." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew it was a fight worth taking on. As she looked out the window of her office, the Atlanta skyline stretching out before her, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning, not only of her fight against Judge Barrett, but of her commitment to ensuring that the justice system lived up to its name. A few days later, Sarah and Gloria sat together in Gloria's office, reviewing the final draft of the formal complaint. It was meticulously written, citing specific incidents of discriminatory behavior and including testimonies from both James Wilson and Mrs. Thompson. Gloria had also managed to secure statements from a few other defendants who had witnessed Judge Barrett's biased actions firsthand. Their accounts painted a clear picture of a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. "This is strong, Sarah," Gloria said, tapping the papers in front of her. "We've got witness statements, documented incidents, and even evidence of similar cases being handled differently by Judge Barrett. We're ready to file." Sarah took a deep breath, looking at the complaint. She knew the risks involved. Judge Barrett was well-connected, and the backlash could be significant. But she also knew that if they succeeded, they could bring about real change, not just in Judge Barrett's courtroom, but in the entire judicial system. "Let's file it," Sarah said, her voice steady. "This is bigger than him. It's about justice for everyone who's been mistreated." Gloria nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll submit this today, and then we'll see what happens next." The complaint was filed the following morning, and within hours, the news began to spread. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it was being discussed on social media. Advocacy groups rallied behind Sarah and Gloria, calling for an investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct. The public response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination in the justice system, and the pressure on the municipal court grew. Judge Barrett, meanwhile, remained silent. The court released a brief statement saying that they would review the complaint, but it was clear that the growing public scrutiny was making an impact. The courthouse, once a symbol of unchallenged authority, was now under the microscope. Sarah continued her work, but now her days were filled with interviews and meetings with advocacy groups. She knew that the fight was far from over, but the momentum was building. One afternoon, she received a call from a local journalist who wanted to do an in-depth story on her experiences and the broader issues of bias in the judicial system. Sarah agreed, knowing that the more light they could shine on these injustices, the harder it would be for people to ignore them. A month after the complaint was filed, Sarah received an official notice. Judge Barrett was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It meant that the system was taking their claims seriously, and that change was possible. Gloria called her that evening. "We did it, Sarah. This is just the beginning, but it's a step in the right direction." Sarah smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Gloria. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Gloria replied, her voice warm. "But I'm glad you didn't have to. Now let's keep going. There's still so much work to be done." Sarah knew she was right. The fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. They had taken on the system, and they were winning.